Welcome everyone. Almost 3 years ago, I sat in the canteen with my old boss, and he said to me, "We've got space in our role-playing group. Do you fancy joining?" And I thought, "Oh, I'm not sure that's for me." But I like my old boss, and we were good friends, and so I said yes. And I can honestly say it's one of the best decisions I have ever made. Over the last few years, particularly with COVID and being locked down and all those things, it's become a real pillar of my life. And driven a passion for storytelling, and that's what brings us here today. And Jeff and I have spent many hours in that lockdown period over coffee discussing storytelling. And we started noticing lessons that we think are powerful for agile teams, for all teams, hopefully. And that's what brings us here today, to share those with you.
So, to begin with, throughout our talk today, we'd like you to consider the question posed here by our resident dragon. Why do we still tell stories? Why do we feel compelled to tell them? And why do they matter to us? But before we get too ahead of ourselves, we should probably make some proper introductions.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm our resident Agile wizard who's going to guide you through this talk. I'm also a bard in one of my games and a game master.
And I'm Jeff. I'm Chief Product and Technology Officer for X-Design, and I want to be tech cleric. Although I'm not a very experienced tabletop gamer, I love retro games and any excuse to bring a different angle into agile software delivery, one that we can all hopefully relate to today.
We'd also like to introduce you at this point to our resident dragon, Nigel. Everyone please say hi to Nigel. We are going to be teaching you to kill our nemesis throughout this talk, so sorry Nigel in advance. I know what you all think when you see the description of this talk. Role-playing games, what, like Dungeons and Dragons? How can that have lessons for agile delivery? Well, in the simplest terms, it's because they're both magic. No, really. They are the magic of a group of people gathered together with a shared goal who, through collaboration, courage, openness and respect, navigate through a series of challenges to eventually create something significant.
So there are many parts of telling a tale that could make interesting talks, but today we're talking about what is our opinion, probably the most important part of a quest, and that's starting it. Sure, some start by accident, but argue they're more kind of adventures than quests, which are by their very definition a purposeful endeavour for something, often knowledge, victory. With that in mind, we've structured this in a kind of logical order. The steps in sequence that you could start to take a new team on a journey. A story that they're part of and that they live and interact with. And this is where it's a little bit different from just regular storytelling. First, we're going to discuss telling your tale and what the tale is anyway, how we make it compelling, collaborative, and interactive. Then, we'll talk about creating and shaping your party of heroes, the team shape, the cohesion, and the psychological safety aspects. Then we're going to discuss what kind of monster we're trying to slay, i.e. setting a vision that your party will buy into, and how you'll actually get your people inspired. And then we're going to do a little bit of, it's an example workshop, unfortunately, because we're not really blessed with a lot of time. We're going to give you the kind of template for this workshop, which we can probably circulate later on, for defining and understanding your own characters in your team, kind of self-awareness and progression elements. And then what we'll then talk about is actually adding elements of randomness and other changes into the process to keep everything fresh on your journey.
So, to telling our tale, this is all really about setting our boundaries that help us define our space to collaborate and to thrive. If you tell someone that you're writing a book, their first question is going to be, well, what kind of book? Is it fiction or non-fiction? What genre is it? In collaborative storytelling and role-playing games, that becomes, what system are you using? D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, is the most famous and the most common, but there's a world full of others. And in a product world, it could also translate to, what's our problem? What are we trying to solve? What's our user need? So we're outlining our universe, our world that we're going to exist in. and setting those boundaries for our group. We're then going to pull together our group of characters and form our party and set them on the quest to slay a dragon, hopefully.
Yeah, and remember, there's always, nothing exists really in a vacuum. There's always a wider story arc outside of your individual quest. Programs are usually larger than a project. There are entire movements in IT, like digital transformation, that are industry-wide and are huge. We can't understand all of these in great detail, but framing your quest within this universe is really helpful when visualizing what kind of difference you'll make, be that in a quest or be that in a project.
When getting together to play a role-playing game, we've got a big, hefty rule book, or often several. And those rules are essential. But when you start playing, you learn that there are more essential rules than those. So actually things like, what works for you? What works for your group? What rules do you all find really annoying that you'd rather do without? Or what extra bits do you need that make it more fun for you? And that kind of starts building our etiquette and that intuitive way that we start working together. And we often call those house rules. So the rules that we set for ourselves that we can then treat as gospel for the future. It's all about finding what works for you. And in an agile world, that might translate to a team charter. What rules can you set that work just for your team and make your team more effective? There's also the ultimate house rule, the rule of cool, where all other rules are swept to one side and we're going to let this happen, even if it doesn't quite fit our rules, because it'll make a cool part of our story. If it's cool with everyone at the table, we're going to go with it. And I think that's a really nice analogy for, we didn't think this bit of Scrum worked for us, so we changed it.
Yeah, and I'm sure at some point, if you've been involved in an IT project, you'll start thinking, well, we're not in a very agile environment. And I think I've seen this work before. Even in a non-agile environment, or even one that's highly regulated like FS, you can still set rules and practices within your team to provide this kind of environment, as long as they don't break regulatory compliance and things. The storyteller, or in this case Scrum Master, may have to mediate between the two worlds. And this is where actually you see, I think one of the genuine qualities of a really good Scrum Master is the mediating between the world of the kind of more waterfall or other regulatory compliance areas and the actual agile team. It's difficult, but with the right kind of dedication, we've seen it work well even in very traditional organizations. Jeff
Touched on them there, our game master, and in agile terms, that's often our Scrum Master. They are our servant and our leader. They serve the group by creating a world within which the story has been told. They are every NPC, every event that the group of players come across. They also lead the group in a way. They have to do a lot of the arranging, making sure that people actually show up and get involved. But even more than that, similar to a Scrum Master, they're responsible for creating that space to let people be themselves, let them thrive, let them grow together. We want to be a guide. We also want to create a space for everyone to tell their part of the story. And it's really crucial that that's all of us. If those implicit rules start breaking, if somebody wants to suddenly be the main character, that's not collaborative anymore. That's just someone taking over, takes away agency, stops others from enjoying it. Key rule here is that the journey's more fun when we're going on it together.
And I think this is where interactive storytelling differs from the kind of storytelling you might have read about before. The kind of, if we do a TEDx talk, they give you kind of guidelines on how to tell your story. If you're doing a sales pitch, if you hope to be successful, there's a lot of good storytelling in there. But the key here is like the interactive storytelling, which brings it back to the idea of role-playing games. It's not just the Scrum Master or whoever it is just issuing forth. It's interactive. You're providing the framework for the story, but not the individual events. But it's your job to kind of keep people on point and straying too far from the tale itself.
In terms of guiding the tale, some crucial points. We want to provide focus and provide progress towards a goal, but in that, give people freedom, but within those boundaries. Allowing the team to grow through exploration through interacting with stuff that they didn't expect. And also leave time for social interaction, because strong relationships make a good, strong team. With an idea of the story we're going to tell, next we'll move on to forming our party of heroes. When doing this, a few things to keep in mind. People aren't just job titles. Characters aren't just their class. Best groups are some of their parts. And collaboration is always key, particularly over having individual superstars. And absolutely crucially, the right team over the right now team every time, making sure that we've got that chemistry and letting the team grow together.
I think this is where actually the analogy also kind of works, because this is where scrum team really is more like a fellowship. There may be a loose hierarchy, but each person in that team has a very important role to play. I'd also argue that a good team isn't fungible, and I've seen people do this before, where they plan via spreadsheet. They go, well, we can swap this scrum master out, these two developers out, this tester, because they're all equivalent. All people are just on a spreadsheet, and that works. No, there's that fine, nuanced balance of skills. Choosing the right party of heroes for your quest is not something that happens in a spreadsheet. It pains me to have to say that, but it still happens today.
Some other things to keep in mind. Party size is important. Running a party that's too big gets chaotic and really hard to run, and means that people stop interacting, stop getting to know each other as characters. When enlisting people, we should speak to them individually. Give them our vision, our values and our mission. Tell them the boundaries that we're going to work within. We might even use a character sheet to understand the qualities of our team members, and we'll come on to that later in our talk. We may also run some icebreaking activities to help them get to know one another.
Yeah, and I think also it's important, despite it being a team, it's also still important to get to know each one of them individually, understand them on the singular level in the context of that party to make sure there's a good fit, and let them air some of the thoughts they might not put out in a group setting.
What happens if they don't fit? If they don't buy into the values? If they don't want to go on the same quest as everyone else? They might not fit with our team profile, or just might not be in the right mindset to join at this time. There's a really commonly quoted problem on forums and things like that of a player saying, I'm just doing what my character would do, or that isn't something my character would do, to justify behaviour that doesn't quite fit with the rest of the group. And I think the key thing here to remember is that it's all about that group and that group health. If a team member or character doesn't buy into the group's values or the quests, that's okay. They can either go away and come back with a new character next week that does fit, or they can go and find another group and enjoy that there.
Yeah, I think if somebody isn't a right fit for this team right now, there's no shame in that, and that's happened many a time in my career. They'll be fit for another team or the team at a later date. And I think it's really important not to underestimate the drag factor of the wrong mix. It can be absolutely ruinous. I mean, some good examples include Brooks' law, which suggests that adding more people to something that's running late actually makes it run later, and the reverse being that the Bermuda plan that you might have heard of, where you kind of send away the people who aren't necessarily the key part of the team and actually bring in the project to actually start delivering on time.
Key message there, just prioritise that team chemistry.
So, we've given some background and found our team of heroes. And now we introduce the challenge element, our dragon. Aside from introducing Nigel the dragon, which we've already done, we should further discuss introducing a project's monster. As we've discussed, when telling a collaborative story, it's essential that we're telling it together as we go. While there might be a guide who's setting the scene, introducing adversity, etc., they're not writing the characters up front just to insert names into later. Instead, we introduce an antagonist, a great challenge, which we allow our players to explore, find mighty swords, potions and magic spells, and they add to their arsenal to eventually slay the dragon, which is just progressively delivering in an agile world. And despite it being fun, kind of a fun name for the talk, it is a fun name, I think, slaying a dragon isn't a great reason for a story. You don't just go, I fancy killing something, because that makes you look like a lunatic. You set out to kill a dragon to save your home, to make the world a better place, to see captured loved ones. The user need is not to slay the dragon, it's to stop the dragon from being a threat, protect the things we love, etc. So we've met our nemesis, the great winged beast, harbinger of death, whose name we barely dare say, Nigel, the Wrathful. Let's talk about something in the real world. And finding the challenge from the actual client brief is one of the important bits. That's I think, one of the key things. And you can tell any story and make it boring. There was a famous British cartoon show that used to have the character find an excuse for why he didn't turn up for 2 days, and it would always be the topic of a film or a song or something, and he'd tell you the most boring way possible. And I think that's the important thing as being the person who's setting up the team for success, is finding the cool thing about what you're doing. And I've seen incredibly, what could be things like financial regulatory compliance, and people have made it cool. People have made it a challenge. It could be rescuing a broken project. You might be the SWAT team being parachuted in. Even just saying the SWAT team being parachuted in, that automatically gets a bit of energy up. You might be making a mobile app for an event like this. I'd have probably made it perform a bit quicker. Meeting the regulatory compliance, etc. But putting the party's quest in the context of the overall saga, the story arc of it all, where do we fit? This is where you get to stretch your storytelling skills without terrifying your audience. And I think there was another part that's really key to storytelling, is using comparison and metaphor is really important. Because software is inherently pretty abstract, especially if you're getting into some of the scarier sectors. And part of augmenting storytelling is drawing comparisons with what we already know, what we've grown up and learned as we live. If I tell you an animal is big and nothing like you'd seen before, it's what am I thinking of? If I tell you that the animal is like a huge hairy elephant, then you'd probably think I was talking about a mammoth. The context is really key. And as this is an interactive story, try to introduce the questions, the things that team will kind of have to figure out themselves. We have a mountain to climb, but finding the route itself is a job for the team, not a single person. And the key part of this storytelling in this context is the model building and asking some dramatic questions. Create a want and excitement around the challenge, and create a visualization either physically or in your team's minds. And once we've framed the challenge, it's time to break it down to something more manageable. And this is where we use another storytelling technique. One of the key elements to storytelling and fiction is not what goes into it, but what you leave out. Focus helps people visualize. Once you've got your grand quest and made it clear, it's time to actually focus down on the things that you're doing next. Not many stories start with a crescendo. It would kind of be the wrong way around, unless you're watching Memento. But you don't start with the final boss battle. So don't try and boil the ocean, at least not in one go. Figure out how you can make your challenges progressive and exciting. And each one should have a feeling of achievement, though. Challenge yourself to break the problem down. If you don't, and you're just doing waterfall with sprints, which I'm sure we've all done by accident before. But also, it's important for it to be challenging, but don't make it impossible. Don't give people the feeling that they've lost before it begun. But also, don't start with nothing. Don't start with things that are trivial. If there's nothing delivered or valuable in a sprint or a quest, and it isn't interesting, it won't capture attention and commitment. It wasn't Frodo and the Fellowship went to buy a bag of chips. Nobody would have read that book. And it's considering a balance of things like passive versus active tasks when you start. Are you just going to book somebody in to listen to 6 hours of workshops, or are you going to actually get them to participate in drawing out possibilities? But the first challenge is often getting equipped along the way. The proprietary tasks, and I'm sure the Scrum aficionados in here are wincing at the idea of proprietary sprints and tasks, but we'll leave that one for the philosophers. But if your team aren't already working as a team before they do this, it'll be a bumpy ride. Okay. After defeating our first minor boss along the way, we might have taken some wounds. So it's time to think about resting and going again. It's important to take time to look after ourselves, look after the team, and ensure we're on the best shape for the next challenge. Now, luckily, if you timed it right, that'll be known. You'll be actually at the inn known as the sprint's end. Using Scrum events creatively will give you more active rest and let you reflect on the next phase in your journey. You could consider what is giving your team energy, what's taking it away. What did you learn from the last skirmish? And as a side note, don't skip your Scrum events. They're the pressure valve for the team. And I'm sure we've all, again, I've seen that happen as well. But again, it pains me to have to labour this one, but they're often the first to fall when the going gets tough. And take the opportunity to inspect and adapt your plans. During this time, ask questions around, did we deliver actual value? If you're constantly in battle, constantly grinding, you won't stop and question the wisdom of your approach. And beware of things like the sunk cost logical fallacy and other cognitive quagmires. And sometimes, changing the type of tasks being worked on is the palate cleanse you need to keep your team velocity high. 10 sprints of grinding for XP will wear even the hardest person down. But we'll talk more about keeping things fresh later. I think finally, be sure to celebrate the successes, the big wins, even the small wins. Call them out. And hopefully, at some point in the future, we can discuss more about that.
We mentioned earlier that we've pulled together a kind of sample workshop. This is the idea behind this is to help build team cohesion and trust, and help people understand each other better. Role-playing games use a character summary, character sheet, to help us express the qualities of our characters, their strengths, their weaknesses, their goals, their fears. They can help us understand our own strengths and weaknesses, and also allow us to have our goals handy next time we're forming our own party.
But when forming a team, it's really important that people just avoid playing to type or being forced to do so. Now, for example, I was a developer once upon a time, but I also spent time being a test manager, and I'd also spent time architecting systems. And people have a lot of other skills that are hidden that some of these exercises can maybe help draw out. And when we actually look at this section, you might see, I don't know if people are familiar with Johari windows. And that was quite by accident. It was only really started thinking about that after we'd written this talk. And the kind of Johari window is basically it's kind of a magic quadrants thing where it's how others perceive you versus it's how you perceive yourself, and what kind of qualities have you got hidden and what ones you don't realize you have in yourself. Some people may say, oh, you're an amazingly inspirational team leader, and you might not think it yourself. And so before you reveal your character sheet to others, it might be useful to find out how others see you, almost filling elements out of it for you. And this exercise is not just self-reflection. It's moving into a bigger part, open part of the Johari window. So
we're aware that this might be a little hard to read. So Jeff's going to read some of this out for you in a minute. Yeah. What we've done is we've pulled together a character summary sheet. So down the left-hand side, you have ability scores. And the idea is that if you're really good at something, you'd give yourself a +3. That would be exceptional. A -1 would be not very good. A -3 would be awful. We've then in the middle got example skills. The idea there being that if you're trained in something, you're probably even better. So give yourself a bonus, a +2 in that thing. We've also left space to add skills of your own and space for things like goals and wellness meters, like when did you last take a holiday or do some upskilling.
So I'm going to read these out because they are far too small. So the ability scores
Mike,
are
Jeff.
intuition. Sorry?
Mike.
Oh, yes, sorry. Intuition, knowledge, adaptability, resilience, team skills, and people skills. And in what we've sort of broken down into individual skills, just as example, so intuition, critical thinking and insight, knowledge, coding, analysis and design, adaptability, self-perception, problem solving, resilience, self-care, drive, team skills, leadership and facilitation, people skills, empathy and relationship building. And we've left some blank ones so you can put your own one in. And over here we've got kind of some wellness meters like, well, how many months has it been since you've taken a holiday? Since you've last had some feedback? Since you've last done some upskilling? Since you've last, whatever other thing you care to add? And it's just a bit of a fun MacGuffin to actually start to figure out and work with your team to actually see what part do you play in this quest.
I'm going to leave that up for another 15 seconds. So just let you have a think about where you would be scoring yourself highly and maybe less highly.
Was there anything on the previous slide? No, that's what I saw. No. Okay.
So how would we then use this with the team? We've asked them to assess themselves. We'd then review the following questions. Does anything on there surprise you about yourself, particularly in the context of our group? What kind of quest would suit you best? How would you use your abilities in the party? And did you add any extra skills that you think are really valuable that weren't our default ones? What skills might you need in your companions to help you complete the quest? And how did your character sheet compare to those of the other party members? Where do you all fit in? Does the party have all the skills it needs?
Yeah, and I think, obviously, if you think you're poor or exceptional at everything, chances are you might need to spend more time in self-reflection or discussing with others. Do you need to work on your weaknesses? Some people argue for and against that. I mean, some things are fairly innate. And how do these results relate to other exercises you've done? So hands up who's done a Myers-Briggs before. Boo. Yeah, do you like Myers-Briggs? I don't think there was many lovers. When I worked with Josh at Digital, we did the Harman Brain Dominance Index, which I found was more useful because it was more about people's strengths. It was another kind of useful MacGuffin in sorting out team composition. So like my example, I'm pretty good at being parachuted into for very scary challenges for short bursts, and long grinds really don't suit me that well. So what's your style of quest? And everybody's different, and there's no right answer. Some people are finishers, some people are starters, some people are just chaotic. And I think it is useful to kind of tie it back to a set of team requirements, the various things required by the team. This is more detailed than just, you're a scrum master or you're a developer. It's slightly more nuanced, because actually if you've got a bunch of people in the team who aren't natural leaders, you might find yourself really rudderless. But if you've got everybody who's a natural leader, you might find yourself in a lot of competition.
And suddenly, our dragon swoops in with more news for you. Keeping things fresh. When a story becomes predictable, it becomes dull. Routine and structure absolutely has its place. It allows us to build rhythm, but too much of the same thing leads to contempt. In collaborative storytelling and role-playing games, this is handled by random results tables. Tables designed with many answers that a game master rolls against to determine the next step. Here's one we made earlier. The idea here being random icebreakers, and no, we're not going to make you do this right now, I promise. So you would roll a d6, which is your standard six-sided dice, and pick an icebreaker, whether that be a rock, paper, scissors tournament, or two truths and a lie, or perhaps even would you rather. There are other possibilities too. So could we do a randomised retrospective format, randomising who facilitates an event to ensure that everyone builds those skills throughout our team? Randomised picking team socials so that we don't always do the same thing. Or choosing a random area of the delivery that we're doing to showcase, or a random part of the product to try and break in testing.
I like to do this kind of thing for problem solving as well, kind of with things like wrong kind, answers only kind of exercises. I think there's a lot you can introduce into the everyday to actually stop people from becoming too passive. I think when a team is just in a grind, they go from active mode, being excited, into quite a passive mode, and it almost happens overnight. We literally sleepwalk into it. But it doesn't mean you should randomize like critical business objectives or team roles, because that'd be a really bad project manager, or anything project breaking. But back to our question from Nigel. Why do we tell stories? Do you have some more ideas formed in your head about the importance of them now?
Our first quote comes from the American writer Joan Didion. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images. I think that's really powerful. This one's from a slightly different source. Brendan Lee Mulligan is a professional game master, and this is merely weeks old as a quote. Why do we tell stories? To try and make sense of a world that can be terrifying and enormous. But why is that powerful for you and your teams? To inspire, to give a sense of purpose and belonging, a home, to help our teams make sense of complex ideas and problems. It can help people relate and draw them in. So, we have our party, their quest. They've started getting to know one another. It's time to set forth.
So, set yourself up to succeed. I think that's a really key takeaway. I think you can actually positively do this. A lot of these things are probably not 100% new to you. You've probably been doing some of these innately, but concentrate on them. Make sure there's a vision, there's a mission, there's a team, and there's house rules.
Be confident in your vision, but be flexible in how you get there.
But we hope that our lessons from collaborative storytelling can help you team bond in a more cohesive and party of heroes.
And hopefully we've given you a tool or two to keep things fresh along the way.
And a team that is invested in where they're heading is much more likely to get there.
Remember that team chemistry is crucial.
And slay the dragon. Sorry, Nigel.
Any questions?
If anybody's got the hand up, we can't see you. Oh, we can see you. We can see you.
Do people in organizations sometimes feel, in your experience, psychologically unsafe when you try to introduce a playful element?
I think introducing playfulness can be misinterpreted very easily as unseriousness or childishness, and I think through things like this, hopefully we can dispel that and show that they're really useful tools. You know, getting people to believe in what you're doing is absolutely crucial for performing well.
How do you go about your first step, given that you have a bunch of stone faces? You can see behind the stone faces they are scared. How do you dispel fear?
How do we dispel the fear of doing fun things like this? By trying to draw them in, I think. By trying to show them the benefits, show them why it's working. But at times my answer might also be, I wouldn't. You know, this can just be for the team. It doesn't need to be what you're telling everyone on the outside.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think if your team that you're building, and if you can't build psychological safety, I think there's a wider organisational problem.
Yes.
You said that some of the random kind of fun factors are introduced to relieve boredom or stop you sleepwalking into this kind of repetitive tasks with the team. What are your warning signs for that? When do you start seeing that? How do you notice it first?
I think you notice the boredom and the rhythm change a little bit. I think you see a change in energy, and that's what I would be looking out for. I think I'd also just acknowledge that it's something that's bound to happen, and actually, even if you're not seeing it yet, that might just be that you've not picked up on it.
I think what you can see quite often, the ideas stop coming. People stop talking about it in whatever communication tool you're using. People start effectively falling asleep at stand-up. You can usually see when the team's becoming disengaged. And usually there's kind of a time element. If your team's been going for a year and you haven't changed anything, you're probably starting to get really bored.
I'd also recommend things like health checks as well, just making sure you're checking in with your team. The back.
Yeah, you mentioned how important it is to get the right sort of personalities and goals from each individual in the team. Is there anything you do differently sort of during the interview process, or anything like that, to ask people about their visions, their goals, their personality, or you just get them in on a trial basis and maybe from there?
I think being really strong in personality fit on interview is the most important thing.
That's my heuristic. Basically, I ask myself at the end of it, if they, without introducing too much bias, trying to do I feel that this person would contribute to the team, and am I happy that they start my team on Monday? And if the answer is yes, let's hire. And if I'm like going, oh God, no, I'll give them to somebody else, I'll give them to Nick in accounts or something, then the answer's no.
Remember that you spend as much time with colleagues as you do with family and friends often. So actually, the question you've got to answer is, do I want to spend all my week with these people? There's one over here.
You mentioned that if somebody's not right for the team, that's sort of clear, and you move on and find the right team. But how do you do that without becoming exclusive?
I think it comes back to those implicit rules, being decent, being welcoming. It's not just that we are closed off and don't want anyone else, but acknowledging that to be the right fit, you need to have certain qualities and buy into a certain way of existing in our team.
I think there's a kind of who watches the watchman thing there as well, because I'm sure there's somebody at some point, well, I've seen it happen before, where they just go, right, we're going to take all the elite developers, no matter how pleasant they are to work with and bunch them all together because we've got something hard to deliver. And there needs to be some kind of checks and balances going outside to say, are you actually creating sustainable teams?
Any more? In the back.
You talk about organically moving on to the team. What happens when it's like the person that's been in the team for a long time, the team changes around and they're a bit more sticky?
I think whether someone's new to the team or has been in the team a long time, if they're playing with that team chemistry, it's still a problem. And yes, the team might have started forming around them, but then how would the team...
I meant like the team that formed and left them kind of behind or something. So they're like team member number one. You tend to think they've got more of a right to the team. How does that
So I guess the analogy is they're the longest serving player, but everyone else has kind of moved on from them. Yeah, I think my answer's the same, I'm afraid. It still comes back to group chemistry.
And I think there's a really important one there, because we both work in consultants and have done for a long time, is you need to start rotating people. You can't have somebody staying on a project for 4 years because they become too much of a dangerous SME. They stop becoming like a developer or a scrum master. They become an SME for the client effectively, and it gets a bit dangerous. And I think you've got to acknowledge that no matter, they might want to stay on there, but actually it's time to change things up a little bit.
I think that's the purpose of the exercise, or anything similar like a Johari Windows or an HBDI. I think acknowledging, taking the time to do an exercise like that, and if you have got a bunch of people that are identical, then it could be interesting, or it could lead to problems, and you maybe need to look at making sure that your next hire is someone that is quite radically different, or rotating people in and out. Okay, that feels like all of them.
I think we'll get kicked out if we stay any longer anyway.
Thank you very much.